Well, it's November 2nd and no one in the class has shown up yet. I don't know if they had some sort of daylight saving time issue, but I am going to go ahead and record this talk on Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick, and people can tune into it later. It will be not a full class period for sure, because I was really hoping that we would have discussion on this very interesting topic. But seeing as I have no students, I will just go ahead and talk about Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick. So what you are reading, I hope you are reading, are two excerpts from her groundbreaking books in the late 80s, early 90s. The first one is a book called Between Men, and the second book is called Epistemology of the Closet. So these are very much literary critical books, and she makes a lot of literary arguments about specific texts in the books. But the introductions to these texts also set out some really important theoretical issues that helped lay the groundwork for thinking about gender studies, whether gay and lesbian literature, whether how to approach teaching the so-called master canon, taking into account gender studies and the fact that not everyone is straight. And of course, once again, as in other civil rights kinds of movements, the nomenclature is tricky, right? So homosexual, gay, lesbian, LGBTQ plus is a later incarnation. And the fact that the name keeps changing and expanding reflects different concerns and different theoretical and not just theoretical, but different groups arguing for their inclusion and their recognition, such as trans men and women, or trans people, or non-binary people. Again, this is something that Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick could maybe think about a little bit when she was writing in the late 80s and the early 90s. But at that point, and this is why she calls one of her books The Epistemology of the Closet, it was very much a kind of taboo subject, especially in the academy. In some ways, academics, the ivory tower tends to be conservative by nature, right? And so it takes a long time for things to get reflected. But I think it's also worth noting, and of course this was happened long before y'all were born, but this was a time of the AIDS crisis. And part of the reason it was a crisis is that no one wanted to admit that they had the disease. It became associated with gay men, and there were outbreaks, but also, of course, it's not, it's a virus. It doesn't discriminate. So, plenty of heterosexual people got AIDS too, but the idea that it was a taboo topic, and there wasn't funding to do research on this because it was seen as something that only affects gay people. So this slogan, silence equals death, hiding your identity will not protect you, and that it's and that and groups like ACT UP put pressure on the federal government to allot funding to AIDS research and treatment. And so that's kind of the political backdrop for what she's working with. In the first book, she is exploring this idea of between men. And so she's exploring what she calls the range of homosocial, and it's a kind of term that she coins, homosocial relationships between men. So and this is a continuum. Obviously father-son, male friendship, male mentorship, entitlement, rivalry, hetero and homosexuality, and intimate and shifting relationships. Class, of course, and race figuring in as well. But the idea is that there is a continuum, very close, intimate relationships on the one hand, and men as rivals, competitors, and so on. And that there's a whole range. Now, one of what she brings out is that homosocial relationships are much more fraught in our culture. Our culture is still homophobic. So, how relationships with men are presented in literature or on the screen, they have to be, even in so-called bromance or buddy movies, and there's usually a sort of token woman who is the love interest of one of the men, as a way of sort of guaranteeing that even though this movie is really about men's relationship with each other, that these men are quote unquote heteronormative. So that's where she gets this idea between men. And she's drawing on some other theorists, and later on, this is not in the section that you read, but she talks about this triangulation of desire, so that it's taboo for men in our culture to, although perhaps it's less taboo now with the legalization of gay marriage, but certainly when she was writing, it's taboo for men to show affection openly, particularly in a romantic or sexual relationship. And that physical contact between men is, in public, is still very, there's lots of tension perhaps around that. And so the idea here is that they can't express desire for each other directly. So they triangulate through a woman, a female character. So there's a kind of triangle where there is a woman there to sort of guarantee their heteronormativity. But the real relationship, the real thing that's important, is the relationship between men. Now, what she's interested in exploring is the fact that that continuum of relationships between men is treated so differently than the continuum of relationships between women. And so this is part of what she means by, she uses the word desire because she's interested in the way society structures desires, what desires are taboo, what desires are enforced. So heteronormative desires are reinforced everywhere, and that's still, of course, true. And in our sex gender system, not desires that don't fit in with that are taboo, and people who enact those identities or those desires can face intense discrimination, pressure, and even death for their expression of desire, which is not acceptable. So one of the reasons that she's interested in contrasting, why is it that for women, I mean, of course, it's also taboo still, I think, although again, gay marriage has perhaps maybe changing some of that, for women to be openly gay or lesbian. But still, one of the things in the feminist movement was this idea of the lesbian continuum. And the feminist movement kind of embraced the idea. It was kind of a big tent that everyone could be in the feminist movement, from women who loved women to women who were fighting for their rights. They weren't necessarily involved in, they were heterosexual women, mothers, wives, and so on, so that it's a huge continuum. And not to say that there was no tension, but women were not seen as, it was seen as more natural for women to sort of have this whole, to be united along this continuum. Whereas what she points out, and again, this is true of her time especially, that for men, there isn't that continuum allowed, right? You're supposed to fit within a very narrow range, and anything outside that is taboo. So why is that, she says? And one of the things that she does in these, in her work, is to historicize these structures. And part of the reason for historicizing them is pointing out that they're not inevitable. They're not, they can be different in different societies. And she's interested, for example, in the Greek, ancient Greece, which was of course very patriarchal, and women and slaves were kind of on the same level, and had no rights, and were, not part of the public discourse. And there was a homosocial continuum which allowed for openly gay male relationships, although there were certain ways in which they had to be conducted. It was only not appropriate for older men, for example. And and certainly there were pressures to among the up elite classes to marry and reproduce and so on. But the whole idea of it being much more accepted and sort of part of the structure suggests that it's not you can have a patriarchal system that still oppresses plenty of people, that doesn't necessarily oppress gay men. But in our system, she says, the way our sex gender system is set up, there's a virulent oppression of men, particularly, that men are particularly policed in terms of what is allowed. And again, it's amazing to me. I never would have believed that gay marriage would have been legal in my lifetime. So, and apparently younger people are much more, take these kinds of things in stride, and are not as, have a more acceptance of a range of gender structures than I ever could have believed possible in my lifetime. So things perhaps are really changing. Of course, there's also such a thing as a backlash, and part of our, and maybe it's a little too appropriate to talk about this today, but part of the reason for electing a figure like Donald Trump, who clearly wants to go back to the 1950s, and the 1950s was a time when housewives were in the home and gays were in the closet, and everything was pretty rigid in terms of how you conformed to what you were supposed to do. And and clearly there's a significant portion of the electorate, we'll find out how significant, who part of his appeal is to that idea, that who want to reject all of those kinds of things. Okay, so let me just say a few words about the canon and the question she raises about that. And perhaps, we can talk about these things a little bit next time, but I do want to go on. I will be posting the stories that you're going to be reading and the excerpts from Albert Murray. And perhaps we can use, I can assign this to you so that you will, well, I certainly hope you read Eve Sedgwick. It's not very long, but it's really, she's got some pretty important ideas that she is expounding. So one of the things that so what does all this mean for literature? So one of the things that she talks about is how oppression doesn't work in sort of neatly symmetrical ways. In other words, these structures of desire that are sanctioned by a society, they don't, in our society, a heteronormative society, it doesn't mean that that the way oppression is experienced works the same way. And you know, perhaps that's an obvious point, that racial oppression works different from sexism. Racism and sexism are both forms of discrimination, but they're not identical and they work in different ways. And homophobia also is a form of oppression, but it works in not exactly parallel ways. And one of the ways that she talks about this is how the way literature is studied doesn't sort of lend itself to the same kinds of moves that people who wanted to, feminists who wanted to enlarge the canon, to study women writers instead of just always the same men, or what she calls minority canons, you know, Native American canons, Asian American, Chicano, you know, there's many different kinds of canons that are possible. And so she sort of, and this is again at the beginning of these kinds of changes, right? You know, when I was writing a dissertation, it was still a little risky to write your whole dissertation on women writers, although I did that. You know, you're expected, if you don't have one of the major guys in there, you know, that could be a problem. So, so she says there, you know, one model of inclusion was, you know, to expand, say, a major anthology like the Norton Anthology to include more women or to include more African-American writers, you know, to expand the master canon. Of course, that's, people pointed out problems with that, because then does that inevitably, that structure of you're just going to add a few, does that tokenize the work? Does that sort of send a message that, well, this work is somehow lesser? So then another strategy was this explode the canon. There's not just one canon, that there's different, there's these, what she calls these mini canons. And I think the list that she gives us is very interesting. So you can have a Francophone Canadian canon, or an Inuit canon, or a blues tradition canon, or a working class narrative, Afro-Caribbean canons, and so on, so that you can look at literature in those different ways, which, you know, opens new questions and allows for more depth and doesn't tokenize, risk tokenizing the writers who haven't been studied previously in any real depth. And so, and also, you know, she points out that how you organize the canon, for instance, canons have traditionally been, and you can still see that reflected in our English department, structured along national lines. So you have English literature and American literature, and, you know, never the twain shall meet. So it's as if American writers are only responding to Americans. Well, you know, the African diasporic writing suggests that, of course, writers respond to all sorts of things. And she points out that in terms of looking at texts from the point of view of gay studies or gender studies. There's two classic texts that very much speak to each other, and one happens to be English, Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, and the other one happens to be, well, they're not exactly the same time, but they're sort of the late 19th century, Billy Budd by Herman Melville. So they're classic writers, but they feature a very similar plot structure and definitely explore male desire, especially male desire that isn't openly acknowledged and therefore turns into violence. And so that's what some of the themes in both of these texts, and yet they're never seen as connecting because of the way the master canon breaks things up. So, but then she turns to the question of, well, has there ever been a gay Socrates or a gay Shakespeare or a gay Proust? In other words, there are plenty of people in the so-called master canon who actually either were openly gay, or maybe not openly gay, but known to be gay, like Proust, or certainly express male desire. You know, the sonnets of Shakespeare that are, you know, include a passionate sonnets to another man. A gay Socrates, of course, he's operating in a Greek culture where that is more of a norm. So how does gay studies approach that, right? Because you've already got a master canon with all of these figures who could possibly be looked at in these terms. And yet that's never been the case, right? So, and this was certainly my experience as a student. It never would have crossed my mind to ask about what was the significance of same-sex relationships in these writers' works. This was, again, and she points out how this is kind of a closet, a kind of a silencing, you know, and there's a whole list of ways in which it's kind of either trivialized, you know, it might have existed, but it really doesn't mean anything. It's not the important part of the text. You know, and they understood it differently back then. And so Platonic relationships, you know, couldn't have possibly between ancient Greeks, you know, included any kind of intimacy that was sexual, you know, basically all different ways of saying that there's no proof and therefore we can't even talk about that, or new critical approach, you know, the writer's sexual orientation or love life is totally off limits. And so, you know, we're going to just study the works. So what she's saying is that all of that creates an issue with, well, how is it possible then to look at these texts in new ways, to explore them in ways that, especially in the context of you know, a homophobic culture, and so she's proposing that, you know, that this is a new and important way to look at literature, and to ask questions that haven't been asked before. So I had hoped to have a pretty good discussion about these issues with y'all today, but I don't know if it's the time change or what, but as I said, no one was in class today. So I will be posting this recording. I hope you do read Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick, because she has some very interesting and important questions to ask us. And so maybe we can talk a little bit more about, how do you see this issue of gender or gay literature or gay studies? Okay, I'm signing off for today.